All right, so tonight is Tu B'Shvat. Very, very interesting day in the Jewish calendar, an exciting day, a beautiful day, and a day that, interestingly enough, more and more people are like getting into it, getting into various different ways to observe Tu B'Shvat. There was a time when people ate, like when I was a kid, we grew up, you ate a little bit of fruit or something like that. You tried to make a shehecheyanu on a fruit, a bracha, a blessing on a fruit that you haven't eaten all year. But, Kabbalistically, there's always been this concept of a Tu B'Shvat Seder. And it was never a thing. I never heard of it growing up. But you see it now more and more, I guess, in the age where people are thirsty and people are looking and people are yearning and people are more open to Kabbalistic ideas. So this idea of a Tu B'Shvat Seder is something that the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, wrote about, or other Svarim, other books, bring it in his name of something that he would do, is becoming, you're seeing more and more shuls, more and more organizations do this. So it's interesting. It's interesting just to see sort of the development of this day. I think also in an era where people are more sensitive to the earth, to the weather, to climate, to things like that, respecting the earth, a generation that views itself as being sort of more considerate. Also, Tu B'Shvat sort of takes on this like a modern Earth Day type of thing. But what we'll try to do today is get in a little bit to some of the Kabbalistic ideas behind it. There is a lot of mysticism behind this day. And what is it that for us, what are supposed to be our takeaways, both intellectually, spiritually, but also in practice? Is it just about, eating some fruit tonight and tomorrow, or is there actually something that we can take away that we could apply daily? That's what we'll speak a little bit about today. So I just want to begin, because this is part 3 of the series on darkness to dawn, focusing on the time period between Hanukkah and Purim. And we said that the time period has a name to it, and that is, if you remember back to the first class, we said that the time period is called, you remember? Shovavim. Shovavim, having to do with it's an acronym actually for the Torah portions that we read. Shemot, Va'era, Bo, Bishalach, Yisro, Mishpatim, spells Shovavim, which is also a play on words for the verse in Yirmiyah that says Shuvu Banim Shovavim, return those who have gone astray. And we said that there's something very opportune about these times as we're reading about the Jewish people in Egypt, the Exodus. This week's Torah portion, we're reading about they're already out and the sea is going to split for them. They're given the manna in the desert. They're given the well of water in the merit of Miriam. So all of the miracles that happen for them to transition them out of Egypt, prepare them to receive the Torah, happens in this week's Torah portion. And we said that as we're reading about all of these Torah portions, one of the themes in our avodah, in our personal spiritual work, is one of learning to elevate the physical. So in our first class, when we first introduced this topic, we spoke about the idea of elevating sexuality. The second concept, when we introduced the month of Shvat, we spoke about creativity. And today we're going to use Tu B'Shvat also as a way to further this idea of elevating the physical world. There's a verse in the Torah which is a difficult verse to understand, but it's a very much discussed verse. And on the source sheet that I shared with you earlier in the email, and I'll share my screen with you right now and pull it up. Do you see it on your screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a verse in Devarim. And this verse is discussed when it's not a full verse. It's actually in the context of the laws in Parshas Shoftim that discuss when the Jewish people are at war. When the Jewish people were at war, there were different instructions that they had about not destroying fruit tree. There were certain things, they would do obviously a lot of destruction when they would come into a war zone. But part of the instructions were to not destroy fruit trees. And by the way, we still have that now. That is a prohibition in the Torah. You're actually not allowed to destroy a fruit tree. I remember growing up, there was a shul in my neighborhood, a very, very popular shul that because they have like daily services like one after the other. So like anytime you wake up, you roll out of bed at 10, you need to catch morning prayers. Like they'll always have like around the clock. They call it a minion factory. So their shul burnt down and they needed a temporary location. So right across the street, there was a fellow who had a big yard who put up this temporary little structure to house the shul. But he had this big, beautiful lawn, but he actually had a fruit tree on the lawn. And because of that, they built the whole, they couldn't cut down the tree. So they built the whole temporary shul, which again, it was just like a trailer, but they built the whole thing around this tree. So you actually had a tree smack in the middle of the sanctuary because they couldn't cut it down because it's a fruit tree. But that is actually the halacha, the law in the Torah. You're not allowed to cut down a fruit tree. And the verse says almost like a rhetorical question. If you read it in the context of the verse, it's like a rhetorical question, like, why would you kill a tree? Like, you're there, you're in the middle of war, you're killing soldiers, but why would you kill a tree? And the verse says, is the tree another like, is it another human being? Like, what did the tree do wrong to you? That's kind of what it's saying in context. But when you take it out of context, the actual language of ki adam eitz hasadeh, if you take just that line and you translate it literally, it would translate as, for man is the tree of the field. And because of that, the Kabbalistic mystical works go nuts on this one, and they see a lot of depth in this line, this comparison of saying that man is a tree, to which so much the imagery of trees within Kabbalistic texts there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that. A lot of places where the concept of trees are discussed both in its comparison to human beings, as well as its way of symbolizing the shefa, the heavenly flow of God, almost as if God manifests himself through these channels, through these pipelines, through these sfirot, which are often in Kabbalah understood as trees. So trees are very much a Kabbalistic imagery. In fact, the very system of the most common Kabbalistic symbol, the one that we've discussed within the context of our learning going back, many sessions ago, is the image of the Sfirot, the very famous image where you have Keter at the top, and then you have the various branches coming down to the Sfirot, going all the way down to Malchus, which is where God's energy flows into the world. That famous image, you can imagine it with the circles and the lines connecting the circles. I think everyone's familiar with what I'm talking about. That's actually called the tree of life. So trees are a Kabbalistic symbol. They symbolize both us and how we affect the upper worlds, but also how the upper worlds manifest themselves into our world, how they affect our worlds. Are very often the image of a tree is used over there. And therefore, when we come to Tu B'Shvat, which is brought down in the Mishnah by our sages, that Tu B'Shvat is called the Rosh Hashanah for trees, which in context of the Mishnah, which is just speaking about it legally. So legally, well, that's kind of irrelevant to most of us because unless you happen to be a farmer and you didn't tell me about it, right? Most of us, we don't have farms. Therefore, most of the agricultural laws that are relevant to having a Rosh Hashanah for the trees are not relevant to us. Right? So from a halachic standpoint, Tu B'Shvat doesn't really make that much of a difference to us. Kabbalistically, Tu B'Shvat isn't just about something new happening agriculturally, but actually something new happening mystically. So I hope that makes sense just as the first point, and we'll move on. I just want to give a moment if anyone has any questions on that or if that's clear. So where does this comparison come from? So let's try to get into this a little bit in depth. So okay, so the Maharal gives perhaps the most common, the most well-known explanation of this comparison, and he says over here, this is in Sefer Gur Aryeh. He says, what does it mean when we say for man is a tree of the field? And so man is a tree of the field, meaning his branches are in heaven. For the head, which is the root of a man, faces upwards. And this is why man is called a tree of the field, planted in heaven. And through his intellect, he is planted in his place, which if all the winds were to come and blow, they would not move him from his place. So it's interesting. The Maharal is sort of saying, he's comparing it. It's not exactly clear whether the Maharal is saying that the branches are like the intellect or the roots are like the intellect. It kind of sounds like he's saying both. He says his branches are in heaven, which makes it sound like the branches. And you see in many different texts, sometimes you see that the branches are compared to the head. Sometimes you see that the roots are compared to the soul. Right? But definitely there is this idea that the tree itself seems to occupy different realms. You have sort of this underground, these roots that are drawn, that are nourishing from someplace that we cannot see. You have the stump, the trunk of the tree that seems to occupy the space of this world. And then you have the branches and the fruit that seem to ascend to heaven. And that is a metaphor of how us as human beings, and it's a reminder of something that we've said so many times in this Kabbalah class, that we have to view ourselves also as occupying many realms. You're physically in the here and now. You're physically on planet Earth in your body on Wednesday, January 27th, Erev Tu B'Shvat, right? But your roots are someplace deeper. Your roots are in a soulful place that transcends time and space. It transcends physicality. You're drawing from a place that is eternal. There is a lot more to you that's sort of beneath the surface that you cannot see. And in this world, you're always pulling from that. You're always trying to get down and access your roots. And when you're connected to those roots, when you're connected to that soul, then it's always pulling nourishment. And your branches, the result of what you can do in this world, reach up to heaven, which means you're sort of returning, you're pulling from your soul. You exist in this world, in the world of action, in the world of time and space, where you can go, where you can do, where you could accomplish. And through that, you're sort of returning the flow, you're returning the energy back up to heaven through your branches, right, through your fruit, by what you can accomplish, but what you can produce in this world. And because of that, Tu B'Shvat becomes a very, very special day, because where it seems like in the dead of winter, the trunk of the tree is not attached to its roots, or at least it's not pulling, it's not nourishing from its roots, and that's why it looks dead. That can be compared to the human being who goes through cycles in their life where they feel like they're dried out, where they feel like they're burnt out, they feel disconnected, they feel like it's time to yearn for something more, for something greater. And the same way on Tu B'Shvat, where now suddenly the trees begin to dig deep down into their roots to try to pull up new nourishment, new sap, so too the human being has that ability to dig down, to recalibrate, to reset, to say, okay, now I want to dig deeper, I want to start again, I want to go deeper into myself, and reawaken themselves at any stage, at any point in life. That's the classic way of understanding this comparison of the human being to the tree, of this understanding that the same way the tree occupies those many realms, so too human beings also. We exist really in these multiple places at once, where we're coming from, where we exist right now, and sort of what we're trying to produce. That's what the Maharal over here and other commentaries are touching on. So that's the first point. And we'll go a little deeper, but if anyone has any questions on anything that I just said, you can jump in now. Questions or comments on anything that I just said. Otherwise, we'll go a little bit deeper. If we take a look all the way back in the Torah, we find that trees play a very major role in the story of creation, but not only in the physical development of the world, but in the spiritual development as well. Well, if you take a look at the third day of creation, on the surface it looks like any other day. I mean, it's unique, but we don't necessarily see from the verses anything so shocking until Rashi brings a medrash, and it's a bizarre medrash. But from that medrash, it's a fascinating medrash. From that medrash, a whole conversation is born. So if we take a look over there, these verses that I'm pointing to over here with my mouse, Genesis 1:11, verses 11 and 12, and God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, seed-bearing plants, fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, seed-bearing plants of every kind, and trees of every kind, bearing fruit with the seed in it, and God saw that this was good. Seems like a happy day. God is saying, let's get some trees, let's get some fruit. And it happens as such. We get vegetation, we get seed-bearing plants, we get trees, we get fruit, and everybody's happy. Except for the Medrash. The Medrash jumps in, and Rashi's quoting that, and the Medrash says, whoa, something just went wrong. I don't know if you read the Rashi yet, but if you did not read the Rashi yet, did you notice what went wrong? I don't know that I would have noticed it, certainly not in the English. Maybe if I was reading the Hebrew, maybe. Right? But once the Medrash points it out, kind of in your face, what happened over here? God said, fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit. But what happened? The earth brought forth vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees of every kind. So there's a very clear discrepancy between what God says, fruit trees of every kind that bear fruit, and the earth that produced trees of every kind bearing fruit. There seems to be a word missing. Over here, God says they should be pre-eitz, she'oseh pri, but they produce only eitz oseh pri. In the second verse, it's missing the word pri. And this bothers the Medrash. The Medrash wants to know what happened over here. Did something go wrong? So listen to what Rashi says again, quoting the Medrash. Take a look. Fruit tree. Rashi says that when God commanded it, God commanded that the taste of the tree be exactly the same as that of the fruit. That means that somehow the tree itself is almost part of the fruit. It did not do this, however, but instead the earth brought forth a tree yielding fruit, and the tree itself was not a fruit. Therefore, when Adam was cursed on account of his sin, the earth was also visited and was cursed also. Bizarre medrash. You probably have some questions. I'll let you think about this for a moment, but maybe some questions come to mind. Any questions come to mind when you hear this medrash? Right? What went wrong over here? Right? Is this connected? Rashi seems to connect it to the sin of Adam. Well, the sin of Adam happened later on. So if this chronologically happened, or at least in the Torah's chronology, this happened before the sin of Adam, well, okay, we understand, at least, to a certain extent, even though not that this is any easier to understand, but let's just say that we understand how Adam and Eve could rebel against God. Okay, we understand that. And that, like I said, that itself is complicated. But at least we know that they're beings of free will. Well, are trees beings of free will? What does it mean that the tree disobeyed God? Did God make a mistake? Like, what's going on? Who rebelled? what could have possibly gone wrong on day 3 when God is trying to create trees? It just doesn't seem to make sense. Number one, and why specifically in this way? Why are the sages focusing on this idea that the tree is supposed to taste like the fruit and it doesn't? I mean, like, put yourself in the tree's shoes for a second. Like, does this sound like if you're Mr. Tree and you're trying to listen to God's commandment? Let's just say you had free will. You'd be like, God, you want me to taste like the fruit? Check this out. I'm going to rebel against you and not taste like that. Like, I mean, like, what? Why would that necessarily be the point of rebellion? So again, you can just say the correct way to really ask the question is just, I'm confused what's going on. But if you have to articulate it in a certain way, you can break it down and say, number one, who's pushing back, who's rebelling over here, and number two, why specifically in this way? Those are really the questions one might ask on this midrash.
And why did God say it was good? You know how it doesn't always say that He said it was good? Like Beautiful. Sometimes He said it was so.
Beautiful.
So
why does it? Why does that says right? Good. Why does that chap? Why does that?
It's like, oh, it's good enough.
Good? Doesn't seem like it was so
good enough.
Built. Right. Okay. Good. Yeah. We'll make that the third question as well. So to answer that question, we'll take it question by question. Let's first try to understand who rebelled over here, and how is it possible that the trees rebelled? You need to remember, this is something that we've mentioned many, many times in context of our learning together, and let's remind ourselves that God was not trying to create a perfect world. That was not the goal. Everything in God's world was perfect before God started creating. The goal of creating the world was about creating this imperfect realm in which mankind, can partner with God in its perfection. That was the goal. That was the goal from the beginning. And because of that, there had to be built-in imperfections throughout creation, because that's by nature what God was trying to do. God was trying to create a world in which there would be struggle, there would be free will, there would be choice, there would be good and there would be evil. That being said, when really does that very first imperfection happen? Well, according to the Medrash, we see the first time the world disobeying on day 3. But let's remember that if we go back to the very beginning of the Torah, the second verse of the Torah itself, when it describes the state of the earth at the beginning of creation, it says, right, in the beginning of God's creation, Bereshit bara Elokim, es hashamayim v'ha'aretz, the heaven and the earth, v'ha'aretz hayta tohu v'vohu v'choshech al pnei tehom. We've quoted this verse before. The earth was void, it was desolate, it was empty. The initial description of the state of the earth when God begins the creative process is not of one of perfection. Well, we have this image that like everything was so beautiful, everything is so perfect, and then Adam and Eve came along and they ruined everything. Well, that's not the way the Torah portrays creation. God portrays creation, the Torah portrays creation rather, as God building up a world that is desolate, that is empty, that has darkness on the face of the earth. Why was everything so bad beforehand? Right? If I would ask you, before the world was created, what was there? You would say, well, there was God. So then it should be that the beginning of the Torah should be, everything was glorious, everything was perfect, everything was filled with light. And in that space of light, God created the world. It's not what the Torah says. God built the world on a place of desolation, of emptiness, and of darkness. What happened? Why is that? Why is God building a world on a place of darkness and not on a place of light? If before creation there's only God's light, do you appreciate that question? You hear the question, right? And the answer is that God could not create the world on that place of light, Because that place of light, like we said in the Kabbalah class, and like we said in the Hanukkah class, and like we said in many of the other series, that place of light had no room for a world to exist in it. The place of light that had God's pure light was a place so perfect. You can't build on perfection. Perfection is already perfect. The only way that you can build is if there's something that needs to be fixed. So that means that God has to pull himself out of the picture. God has to conceal his light, known in Kabbalah as tzimtzum. God has to conceal himself, and then in that place of darkness, saying, now I'm building the world. So that means that all potential, all spiritual potential for free will, for darkness, for evil to exist, all of that existed before God started creating. Now, if we take a look at what's being symbolized over here, let's jump to question number 2, and then we're going to go back. This whole idea where God says, whatever God says, and then something goes wrong. There's a pushback. And by the way, this is going to happen not only on day 3 with the trees, it's going to happen on day 4 with the moon. It's going to happen on day 5 with the sea creatures. And it's going to happen on day 6 with Adam and Eve. Every single day from the 3rd day on, creation is pushing back against the word of God. What's happening? How's that possible? What's happening is as follows. When God says something, God speaks about perfection. God speaks about the ideal. But God is not trying to create a perfect world. That's our job. God says, this is what should be. Now, world that's in the space of darkness, you're going to develop, and you're going to reach a certain point, and then you're going to stop. Man, Adam and Eve, you're going to be inserted into this picture on day number 6, and you're going to take the world from that place of imperfection, and you're going to bring it the rest of the way home. Everything that I said during the 6 days of creation that didn't happen, who's going to make that happen? You're going to make that happen. I specifically left off, like the last piece. That's your job. That's for you to do. When God says trees should taste like the fruit, that's the end game. Fruit, that's where we're trying to get to. The fruit is what's edible. The tree is the process of how to get there. And when God says, let the tree taste like the fruit, if we would imagine, let's say, that the fruit is the world of spirituality, the next world, the afterlife, or even this life, but in an enlightened way. That's the goal. That's the destination. That's what we're trying to get to. When God says the tree should taste like the fruit, God is saying, I want the process to be as sweet as the destination. If you don't like your job, but you love the paycheck at the end of the month, right? So what happens? You have delicious sweet fruit. That's your paycheck. But you hate your job. That's the trunk of the tree. So what happens? You have a trunk that doesn't taste that good, but you have good fruit at the end. But that's not the ideal. The ideal is, I love my job. I would do my job if I didn't get paid. I would do my job if I was homeless on the street and didn't get it right because I love it so much. I happen to get paid at the end, and that's great. When a person has that, when a person is living life where both the process and the destination are sweet, that's considered that the fruit tastes like the tree.
But God doesn't say that. Rashi said that. Rashi interprets that that's what God said, that
Right.
it should taste like the fruit.
Right.
I mean, he
Exactly.
does say,
We're
he says
understanding
it should be
the
a fruit
verse.
tree. Right.
Yeah, so meaning we're understanding the verse, right? The verse just says what the verse says. We're trying to understand the verse based on Rashi's quoting the Medrash. Again, we're trying to decipher the language of the Medrash to explain what the verse is saying. So meaning when the verse says, what we know in the verse is God says the fruit should be a fruit tree, but it produces only a tree that makes fruit. So Rashi says, quoting the Medrash, the fruit tree is one where the tree tastes like the fruit, and what it produces is just a tree that doesn't have any taste. So what we're saying is that the ideal is that our physical world, this is the important point right here. God is saying, listen, I'm creating a world of physicality and a world of spirituality. I'm creating a world where you're going to have to eat, you're going to have to sleep, you're going to have families, you're going to have kids, you're going to have vacations to Miami. That's a shout out to Caroline. Vacations to Miami, vacations to Orlando. You're going to have good food, and you're going to have difficulties as well. You're going to have to worry about your finances, worry about your kids, worry about your mortgage, right? Worry about your job. That's the physical world. I'm also creating a spiritual world. That's the world of prayer. That's the world of Torah. It's the world of Shabbat. And obviously the ideal, the destination, the fruit, that's the spirituality. That's what we're trying to get closer to God. But here's what I want. I want you to learn how to create a tree, a process that also tastes like the fruit. Right, Caroline, after the class is over and you're going to go down to that beach, right, you're not sitting on a beach to fill up your body. You're sitting there to look out into the ocean and to be able to say, this is God's ocean. I'm swimming in God's waters. I'm eating God's food. When we do that, what we're doing is we are infusing the trunk of the tree, infusing the physical world with spirituality. That's that's the goal. But remember, the earth in its creation, or let's just say the angels of the earth that were there to take God's desire and manifest it and put it into play in the physical world. Remember, those angels, their job was to create a world, but to leave some off at the end and to say, okay, we're not here to make a perfect world. We're here to set the stage for mankind to come in and for mankind to say, okay, I'm going to come into this world and perfect it. The tree only produces a tree that doesn't taste like the fruit. That means that the world that Richard Burka, Heidi Eisenberg, Adrian, Nancy, Caroline, who else I'm flipping through, right? Shlomo Buxbaum. We step onto the world, but it's our job. It's our job to make the trunk of the tree, to make our physical life taste like the fruit, taste spiritual, become spiritual, see everything as spirituality. That's our job. That's our service. That's what we're supposed to be doing in this world. We leave that off. To answer the third question, Heidi, what you added over here, and that is this question about why does it say that everything was good? Everything was not so good. The earth just rebelled against God. The answer is good in creation means good. What we think when we hear the word good, we're like, okay, it's all good, everything is perfect. No, that's not what good means. Every single day of creation was about creating a world that was suited, that was a stage for man to enter and take care of business. And if the world would have created itself to perfection, that would not have been Tov. Because that's not the world that man was supposed to enter into. Man was supposed to enter into this perfect world. Day 3 was good precisely because the earth stopped exactly where it was supposed to leave room for man to come in and make the tree taste like the fruit. And take a look at this. Let's look at the next source over here. This is from the Zohar. Now we're getting Kabbalistic. By the way, the reason that it has these little numbers is because I copied and pasted it, and it had footnotes. So I'm sorry, I should have taken that out. The Zohar says, this is, again, commenting on day 3. And God said, let the earth bring forth fruit trees that produce fruit. That's a quote from the verse. This is the Zohar talking. Fruit trees refer, listen to this. Fruit trees refer to the tree of knowledge of good and evil that bears fruit. That produce fruit alludes to the tzaddik, the foundation of the world. The Zohar is adding something interesting to the mix. What was created over here on day 3? The tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's going to be the tree that God says, don't eat from that tree. And Adam and Eve eat from that tree. And they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. When was that created? On day 3. Now I want to share with you something fascinating. Fascinating. Later on, when Adam and Eve eat from the tree, well, it's first, Eve eats from it first. The verse says, Genesis 3:6, that when the woman saw that the tree was good for eating, and a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband, and he ate. You've heard this verse before, probably many times. But did you notice something different this time? I'll read it again and pay very close attention. When the woman saw that the tree was good for eating, what did she see? That
the tree was good for eating, not the fruit was good for eating.
Fascinating. You know, there is one fruit that we have, one fruit that exists that we know of, that is called the tree that comes from the fruit tree. Do you know what fruit that is? The esrog. I have to know what an esrog is, right? Because there's a mitzvah done with an esrog. How does the Torah describe an esrog? It calls it pri eitz hadar. And the commentaries say, when it's describing the esrog, it says the esrog is a fruit that comes from a tree where if you would bite into the branch, you would get a little bit of essence of esrog from the branch itself. Unusual, I never tried it. Not interested in trying it. But what's behind that is the following. What's behind that is that there was a tree, even though trees on day 3 rebelled, there was a tree that did not rebel. Which tree did not rebel? The esrog tree.
But that makes sense, right? Because it makes sense because that's the perfect tree.
That's the perfect tree. So over here, what we said before, we said the Zohar alludes to the fact that fruit tree, what was this fruit tree? The fruit tree, according to the Zohar, was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The woman sees the tree, this one tree that actually does produce itself as a fruit tree. The others are just trees that make fruit, but this is a fruit tree. A fruit tree means that the tree itself tastes like the fruit. The Zohar says that's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The verse later on says that the woman ate from the tree that tasted good. Right? That's that tree. That's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's that etrog tree. What does that mean? Now, how do we understand this? Adam and Eve were put into the Garden of Eden and they looked around at the world and they said, something is wrong over here. Why is it? Why do we live in a world where there's physicality and there's spirituality? They should all be one. Remember, by the way, that, and we've said this before, but it's important to clarify this, that when Adam and Eve ate from the tree, this wasn't like, even though we know that it resulted in God sending them out of the Garden of Eden and lowering their consciousness, it was a downfall, but the eating of the tree itself, when Adam and Eve ate from it, they thought they were doing something good. Mm-hmm. When they eat this, the tree of knowledge of good and evil was not a bad tree. It was an excellent, it was a fantastic tree. They just weren't allowed to eat from it. Why? Because what they were trying to do when they were when they were eating from it was they were trying to perfect the world just like that. God says that's not the goal. I didn't put you here to take a shortcut.
Right.
I
It's a
put you
shortcut.
here for the hard work. And because you took this shortcut, now I'm going to make your life even harder. Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil because they saw a tree, they saw an approach, they saw an avenue that through here, right, if I can access this level of consciousness represented by this tree, then now suddenly I can get myself even higher because now physicality, spirituality, it's all going to be one. God says that's not what you were put here for. You were put here to work. You were put here to struggle with your free will. And now I need to kick you out of the Garden of Eden. Now you need a total downgrade because that's really what you're here to do. You're here to learn, to go through it the hard and the slow way. You're here to develop the aspect of free will and show that you on your own, through the darkness, through the struggle, you're able to elevate the world. That's what our job is here. That's why life is so hard, because we live in a world where the tree does not taste like the fruit. And God is waiting for us to elevate the world, to elevate our physical life, our physicality, that we can get back to that ideal place. On Tu B'Shvat, many of the Kabbalistic commentaries say, when we eat all the time, all eating, but especially on Tu B'Shvat, we focus on this. When we pick up a fruit and we eat a fruit, we're being mitakein. We're trying to fix the sin of Adam and Eve by elevating the physical world. And how does one elevate eating? Well, with fruit, it's easy because there's no such thing as a not kosher fruit. All eating, by the way, all eating, right? Eating is an act. Eating is what is one of the main acts through which, as Jews, we try to rectify the sin of Adam and Eve by trying to elevate the physical world. That's why there's so many rules in the Torah that have to do with eating. Obviously, it's one of the reasons behind kosher, why we're supposed to eat kosher food. But any food that you're eating, even kosher food, the act of eating itself is not by nature a spiritual act, it's a physical act. But we can we could transform it into a spiritual act. How? How do we do that? By making the blessing. Baruch, if let's say you're eating a fruit. Baruch atah, I'm not going to say God's name, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech ha'olam, borei peri ha'etz. Or if it's a vegetable, borei peri ha'adama. Or if it's wine, borei peri hagafen. Or if it's a wheat product, borei minei mizonot. Or if it's most other products, sha'akol niyeh bidvaro. All of those things, every single time we stop for a moment and we utter those words before we eat it, we're elevating the physical world and we are rectifying the sin of Adam and Eve. Now, you know me, I usually do not ever try to share with you any sources which might make you feel frowned upon. Right? That's not my goal. My goal is that we should grow and elevate together. So I never like to share. Obviously there is some harsh text throughout Jewish literature. If you do this wrong, you're going here and that. But again, that's not our approach. But I guess for a blessing we can make an exception, because again, it's something that is so beautiful and so simple. And really, it's something that, again, obviously, it takes the thing with blessing is you got to make it a habit, but not too much of a habit. Because once it becomes too much of a habit, then you just you just rattle it off. Right? But it has to become kind of part of your routine. But it's easy. It's easy to do, and it's really something that anyone on this call, right? If you're not already doing it, right? Again, you start by making, setting some reminders. It's not going to happen immediately every single time, but it's something that everyone could do, periodically, once or twice. So again, so because it's something that's so beautiful and relatively simple, I'm going to take the liberty to share with you a line from our sages, which again could be a little, which will maybe push you a little bit more than you'll typically hear from me. But if you take a look over here, this is a sefer. This is a book that's actually written about Tu B'Shvat itself. It says, it's quoting a line from our sages in the Talmud that say that if you eat from the world, if you benefit from the world without making a blessing, so it's considered like you're stealing from the world. That was it. That was my whole introduction was just to brace you for that line. So it says, so now he's coming to explain. It says the reason that whoever enjoys produce in this world without pronouncing a blessing, that it's considered stealing, is because when you make a blessing, you're drawing down shefa, energy, divinity, godliness into the world. The angel who is assigned to the fruit is filled with shefa. That means that the fruit itself is always, the very existence of the fruit means that this fruit is a manifestation of God into the world. Who made this fruit? So when this fruit exists, or when whatever the food is, when it exists in this world, it's pulling down energy, it's pulling down divinity, it's a gift from God. So therefore, if you eat this fruit, it's here for you. But if you eat it, what happened to that shefa? What happened to that godly energy that existed in the world? You're consuming it. It's gone. What happened to it? So through eating an aspect of creation, I'm on the second page here, without blessing it, he eliminated the spiritual element that it contained. You now decrease spirituality from the world. By the way, you know, the Torah says you're not supposed to kill, right? So we assume, how come you're not supposed to kill? It's mean. Well, that's not why. The reason that you're not supposed to kill is because every single human being has a tremendous amount of godliness that they're manifesting into the world. And you have no right to decrease that godliness. Well, same thing is true when you eat something. Who gives you a right to decrease the godliness that's in this world? You're preventing, as the next sentence says, he prevented that divine power from being manifest in the world. But yet, when you make a blessing, what happens? The energy that you're infusing creation through your blessing, that's replacing the shefa that comes down on the fruit. I'm taking the fruit, I'm removing that godliness from the world, but I'm inserting an even greater godliness into the world. I'm inserting my blessing into the world. If I don't put my blessing back into the world, then I just took the shefa. I just took the energy. I didn't put it back. So every single time you eat, you're elevating that. You're bringing that godliness in. I just want to end next 30 seconds over here. Some fun with numbers. Can't have a good Kabbalah class without fun with numbers. The numerical value of the Hebrew word eitz, ayin sadi, is 160, which has the same numerical equivalent as tselem, image. Every single person is created in the image of God, which also equals 160. Another word for tree is ilan. If you know anyone with the name ilan, it means tree. It equals 91. The same numerical value of these two names of God, the tetragrammaton, Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, which is 26, and Adonai, which is the two of them together equal 91. And then also another acronym over here. When the Torah says on the third day of creation, there should be desha, there should be vegetation. Desha is an acronym for Demus Shel Aviv. Dalid Shin Aleph Demus Shel Aviv, the image of the Father, the Tselem Elokim, the image of God. Our interaction with produce or interaction with vegetation is some way reflecting how we are trying to build up our Tselem Elokim, our image of God. And every single time that we eat this fruit, we have the opportunity to contemplate this, to meditate on this, to make a blessing. And over the course of Tu B'Shvat, it's a reminder of that. So therefore, when we're eating on Tu B'Shvat, it's an exercise in trying to raise up and elevate our Tselem Elokim. That's a little bit of the depth of Tu B'Shvat.